Maxwell Pierce adjusted his custom-tailored Armani suit as he gazed out from the 40th floor window of his Manhattan office. At 30 years old, he had accomplished what most people couldn't achieve in a lifetime. Pierce Technologies had revolutionized the renewable energy sector with its breakthrough battery technology, and as founder and CEO, Maxwell had amassed a fortune that put him among America's youngest billionaires. The New York skyline sparkled before him like a collection of stars brought down to earth, but the reflection in the glass showed a man whose eyes had lost their luster years ago. "Mr. Pierce, the board is waiting," his assistant, Sarah, announced from the doorway. Maxwell nodded without turning around. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. Also, Dr. Reynolds called again about rescheduling your appointment." At this, Maxwell's shoulders tensed visibly. "Tell him I'm busy for the foreseeable future." Sarah hesitated. "This is the 3rd time you've canceled, sir." "I don't need a reminder of things I already know, Sarah," Maxwell replied, his voice carrying an edge that immediately made his assistant retreat with a quiet apology. Once alone, Maxwell rubbed his temples and sighed. Dr. Reynolds was one of the country's top fertility specialists, and Maxwell had sought him out after his ex-fiancée, Claire, had ended their engagement 2 years ago. "It's not your fault," she had said tearfully, "but I want children, Max. A family. And if that's not possible with you?" The medical diagnosis had been clear. Maxwell had a condition that made him essentially infertile. The chances of him ever fathering a child were so minuscule that Dr. Reynolds had gently suggested considering other options. Maxwell had buried himself in work after Claire left. Pierce Technologies had tripled in value, and he had become the darling of Wall Street and Silicon Valley alike. But success tasted hollow when there was no one to share it with, no legacy beyond the corporate empire he was building. The board meeting dragged on for 3 hours, discussing quarterly projections and a potential expansion into the European market. Maxwell spoke with the confidence and authority that had become his trademark, but his mind kept drifting to the empty penthouse waiting for him and the life he had resigned himself to living, successful but solitary. "Excellent presentation, Max," said Richard Coleman, the company's CFO and Maxwell's oldest friend, as they left the conference room. "But you seem distracted today. Everything all right?" "Just tired," Maxwell replied, forcing a smile. "I've been working on the West Coast project until late every night this week." Richard studied him with concern. "You know, not everything has to be about work. When was the last time you even took a day off?" "I'll rest when we hit our target for the quarter," Maxwell said dismissively. "That's what you said last quarter," Richard pointed out. "Look, a bunch of us are going to Sullivan's tonight for drinks. Why don't you join? Melissa's bringing her sister who just moved to the city. She's a pediatric surgeon or something similarly impressive." Maxwell shook his head. "I've got reports to review. Maybe next time." Richard sighed. "You can't hide in that office forever, Max. What happened with Claire wasn't." "I appreciate the concern," Maxwell cut him off, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "But I'm fine. Really." Later that evening, instead of heading home, Maxwell found himself walking through Central Park. The spring air carried the scent of blossoming trees, and families were enjoying the last hours of daylight. He watched a father teaching his son how to fly a kite, their laughter carrying across the open field. A familiar ache settled in his chest, a longing for something he had convinced himself was forever beyond his reach. His phone rang, displaying his mother's name. Maxwell hesitated before answering. "Hey, Mom." "Maxwell. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to use a phone." Elizabeth Pierce's voice was warm but carried a hint of reproach. "Sorry, it's been hectic at work," Maxwell replied, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It's always hectic at work, dear. That's why they call it work," his mother countered. "Your father and I were hoping you might come to Connecticut this weekend. It's been months since we've seen you." Maxwell thought of his parents' spacious colonial home in Greenwich, the family photos lining the walls, the siblings who would inevitably bring their children. A reminder of everything he couldn't have. "I'm not sure I can get away right now, Mom. We're in the middle of some critical negotiations." Elizabeth's sigh was audible. "You know, there's more to life than that company of yours, Maxwell." "I know that," he replied defensively. "Do you? Because your father and I worry about you. Ever since Claire." "I'm fine," Maxwell interrupted a little too quickly. "Look, I'll try to make it out there soon, okay? I promise." After hanging up, Maxwell decided to take a different route home, cutting through a less familiar part of the park. As twilight deepened, the pathways became less crowded. He was about to turn back toward Fifth Avenue when he noticed a small figure sitting alone on a bench, head bent over what appeared to be a notebook. Something about the solitary child made Maxwell pause. It was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, with neatly combed blonde hair. He wore a school uniform, a navy blazer with a crest Maxwell didn't recognize, and seemed completely absorbed in his drawing. What struck Maxwell was that the boy was alone in a rapidly darkening park, with no adult in sight. Maxwell approached slowly, not wanting to startle the child. "Hey there," he said gently. "It's getting pretty late. Are you waiting for someone?" The boy looked up and Maxwell felt the world tilt beneath his feet. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected his own childhood. The boy had the same clear blue eyes, the same straight nose, the same cleft in his chin that Maxwell saw every morning in his reflection. For a moment, Maxwell couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. The resemblance was so uncanny that it seemed impossible, like a hallucination or a dream. "I'm waiting for my aunt," the boy replied, his voice carrying the slight hesitation of someone not entirely sure of their situation. "She was supposed to pick me up after my art class, but she hasn't come yet." Maxwell swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "How long have you been waiting?" The boy glanced at a worn wristwatch. "Almost 2 hours now." 2 hours? Maxwell frowned. "Did you try calling her?" The boy nodded. "Her phone keeps going to voicemail. I'd walk home but it's pretty far and I don't have any money for the subway." He returned to his drawing, adding details to what appeared to be a cityscape. Maxwell should have called park security or the police. It was the proper protocol for a lost child. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from this boy who could have been him at that age. "I'm Maxwell," he said, extending his hand. The boy looked at it for a moment before shaking it with surprising firmness. "I'm Ethan. Ethan Collins." "That's a good drawing," Maxwell commented, gesturing to the notebook. Ethan shrugged. "It's just something I do to pass the time. My aunt says it's a waste of time, but my mom used to say I had talent." His voice caught slightly on the word mom. "Used to?" Maxwell asked gently. "She died last year," Ethan said, his tone matter-of-fact but his eyes betraying deeper pain. "Cancer. I live with my aunt now but she's not really into the whole guardian thing." Maxwell felt a surge of protective instinct that took him by surprise. "Listen, we should probably call someone, the police or child services. It's not safe for you to be out here alone." Panic flashed across Ethan's face. "Please don't. My aunt would be furious and I'd just end up in more trouble. She's probably just stuck in traffic or something." Maxwell hesitated, torn between what he knew was the right course of action and the fear he saw in the boy's eyes. "How about this? We get you something to eat while we wait a bit longer, and if she still hasn't shown up then we'll have to call someone. Deal?" Relief washed over Ethan's features. "Deal." They found a small cafe at the edge of the park that was still open. Maxwell watched in amazement as Ethan devoured a sandwich and hot chocolate, realizing the boy probably hadn't eaten since lunch. As Ethan ate, Maxwell tried to process the bizarre situation. The resemblance between them was undeniable. They could easily be father and son, which Maxwell knew was biologically impossible. "So what kind of art do you like?" Maxwell asked, trying to make conversation. Ethan's face lit up, and for the first time he seemed like a normal, enthusiastic 10-year-old. "I love architecture. Buildings and bridges and stuff. I want to design skyscrapers someday like the ones that change a city's whole skyline." He flipped through his notebook, showing Maxwell detailed drawings of futuristic buildings that displayed remarkable skill for someone so young. "These are incredible," Maxwell said sincerely. "You know, I built a pretty tall building myself. Pierce Tower on Madison Avenue." Ethan's eyes widened. "Wait, are you Maxwell Pierce? Like the Maxwell Pierce?" Maxwell nodded, amused by the boy's sudden excitement. "That's so cool. Your building uses that new solar glass that generates power, right? I read about it in Science Today at school." Maxwell was impressed. "You read Science Today?" "My mom was a scientist," Ethan explained. "She always brought home magazines and journals for me to read. Said it was important to understand how the world works if I wanted to change it someday." The mention of Ethan's mother stirred Maxwell's curiosity. "What was your mom's name?" "Maybe I knew her from the industry." "Catherine Collins," Ethan replied. "She worked in research at Novatech before she got sick." The name didn't immediately register with Maxwell, but Novatech was a competitor of Pierce Technologies in certain markets. "And your dad?" he asked carefully. Ethan's expression closed off. "Never knew him. Mom said he wasn't in the picture." He took a long sip of his hot chocolate, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. Maxwell's phone rang. "Richard calling, probably to check if he'd changed his mind about drinks. He declined the call and turned back to find Ethan staring at him with an intensity that was unsettling. "Has anyone ever told you that we kind of look alike?" Ethan asked suddenly. Maxwell felt his heart rate accelerate. So the boy had noticed it too. "I was thinking the same thing," he admitted. "It's pretty strange." "Maybe we're related," Ethan suggested with a child's simple logic. "Like distant cousins or something." "Maybe," Maxwell replied, though he knew his family tree well enough to be certain there were no Collins branches. After they finished eating, Maxwell tried calling Ethan's aunt using the boy's phone. It went straight to voicemail as Ethan had said. With growing concern, Maxwell realized he might have no choice but to involve the authorities. "I think we need to call for help, Ethan," Maxwell said gently. "It's getting late and your aunt still isn't answering." Ethan's face fell. "She's going to be so mad at me." "Why would she be mad at you? You didn't do anything wrong." Ethan looked down at his hands. "She always says I'm a burden. That she never asked to be saddled with me after my mom died. Sometimes I think." He trailed off, blinking rapidly. "You think what?" Maxwell prompted softly. "Sometimes I think she just forgets about me on purpose," Ethan whispered. "Like maybe she hopes if she leaves me somewhere long enough I'll just disappear." Maxwell felt a surge of anger toward this unknown aunt. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "No one's going to let you disappear, Ethan." As Maxwell was about to call the police, Ethan's phone rang. The boy answered it quickly, his face a mix of relief and apprehension. "Aunt Melissa?" "Yes, I'm still at the park." "No, I didn't leave. I've been waiting exactly where you said." Ethan's expression crumpled. "I'm sorry. I know you're busy." "Yes, I found something to eat." "No, I didn't spend any money." Maxwell could hear the shrill voice on the other end of the line and had to restrain himself from taking the phone away from Ethan. Finally, the boy hung up, looking both relieved and dejected. "She's coming to get me now," Ethan said. "She forgot she was supposed to pick me up because she had a date." Maxwell nodded, feeling a strange reluctance to let this boy go back to someone who clearly didn't value him. "I'll wait with you until she gets here," he said firmly. They walked back to the bench where Maxwell had first found Ethan. The park was mostly empty now, the pathways lit by ornate lamps that cast long shadows. Ethan had grown quieter, his initial animation fading as he anticipated his aunt's arrival. "Can I ask you something weird?" Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Sure," Maxwell replied. "Do you believe in fate? Like things happening for a reason?" The question caught Maxwell off guard. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I used to think life was just a series of random events. Now I'm not so sure." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "My mom always said there are no coincidences, only connections we haven't figured out yet." He looked up at Maxwell with those eerily familiar blue eyes. "I think maybe we were supposed to meet today." Before Maxwell could respond, a car horn blared impatiently from the street. Ethan stood up, gathering his notebook and backpack. "That's her," he said, his voice small again. Maxwell walked with him to the park entrance, where a sleek BMW was idling at the curb. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression of clear annoyance sat behind the wheel. "Thank you for waiting with me," Ethan said, extending his hand formally, like a miniature adult. Maxwell shook it, feeling a strange sense of loss. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." The boy nodded and turned to go, but Maxwell called after him. "Ethan, wait. Take this." He pulled a business card from his wallet and scribbled his personal number on the back. "If you ever need anything at all, call me, okay?" Ethan took the card, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "Okay." Maxwell watched as Ethan climbed into the BMW. The woman, Melissa, barely acknowledged the boy, continuing what appeared to be a heated phone conversation. As the car pulled away, Maxwell stood rooted to the spot, unable to shake the feeling that he had just let something important slip through his fingers. Later that night, in his expansive but empty penthouse, Maxwell couldn't get Ethan out of his mind. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Catherine Collins. There wasn't much: a few publications in scientific journals from her time at Novatech, a brief obituary that mentioned she was survived by her son Ethan. Nothing that explained the uncanny resemblance between Maxwell and the boy. On an impulse, Maxwell opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder labeled Medical Records. He flipped through the pages until he found Dr. Reynolds' detailed diagnosis from 2 years ago. The clinical language was precise: severe oligospermia, extremely low sperm count, less than 5% motility. The chances of natural conception were described as negligible to non-existent. Maxwell had grieved this reality, had accepted it as his fate. But now, faced with a boy who could be his clone, doubt began to creep in. Maxwell picked up his phone and, despite the late hour, dialed Dr. Reynolds' private number. He would get to the bottom of this mystery one way or another. Because if there was even the slightest chance that Ethan Collins was somehow connected to him, if fate or coincidence or whatever you wanted to call it had brought them together for a reason, Maxwell wasn't going to let that connection slip away again. Dr. Reynolds' office was exactly as Maxwell remembered it, tastefully decorated in muted tones designed to put anxious patients at ease. The fertility specialist reviewed Maxwell's file with a furrowed brow. "I understand your concern, Mr. Pierce, but the diagnosis hasn't changed," Dr. Reynolds said. "Your condition makes natural conception highly improbable." "Improbable but not impossible?" Maxwell pressed. "In medicine we rarely deal in absolutes," Dr. Reynolds conceded. "But we're talking about odds so low they're essentially negligible." Maxwell leaned forward. "I need to know for certain. Is there a way to determine if a child is biologically mine?" The doctor raised an eyebrow. "A paternity test would be definitive. But Mr. Pierce, may I ask what prompted this sudden inquiry?" Maxwell hesitated before explaining his encounter with Ethan. Dr. Reynolds listened with professional interest. "And you've never met this boy's mother before? Catherine Collins?" "Not that I recall," Maxwell replied. "But there's something there. The resemblance is too strong to be coincidence." Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "I'd recommend treading carefully. If you're considering pursuing this, there are legal and ethical considerations." The next day, Maxwell found himself parked outside the Brooklyn Public School listed in the information he'd gathered about Ethan. He knew what he was doing bordered on stalking, but he couldn't shake the need to see the boy again. When school let out, Maxwell spotted Ethan immediately among the crowd of children. The boy was alone again, walking with his head down until he noticed Maxwell standing by his car. "Mr. Pierce?" Ethan approached cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to make sure you were okay after the other night," Maxwell said, feeling suddenly foolish. "And I had an idea I wanted to run by you." Ethan looked surprised but not displeased. "What kind of idea?" "There's an architecture exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum this weekend," Maxwell explained. "I thought you might be interested. With your aunt's permission, of course." A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "She won't care. She's going to Atlantic City with her boyfriend." "She's leaving you alone for the weekend?" Maxwell asked, alarmed. Ethan shrugged with practiced indifference. "It's not the first time. She says I'm old enough to take care of myself." Maxwell made a split-second decision. "Come have a snack with me. We need to talk." At a nearby cafe, Maxwell listened as Ethan described his life with Aunt Melissa. The neglect, the constant reminders that he was unwanted, the emptiness of his existence since losing his mother. "My mom never talked about my father," Ethan said, picking at his muffin. "When I asked, she'd just say he wasn't part of our lives and change the subject." Maxwell chose his words carefully. "Ethan, have you noticed how much we look alike? It's unusual." Ethan nodded. "I thought about it all night after meeting you. It's weird, right? What would you think if I told you I believe there might be a connection between us? Something more than coincidence?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Like what?" Maxwell took a deep breath. "I'm not sure yet. But I'd like to find out if you're willing." That conversation led to an impromptu dinner, where Maxwell learned more about Catherine Collins, a brilliant biochemist who had worked for several research firms before her illness. Ethan showed him photos on his phone, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and Ethan's smile, though she didn't resemble Maxwell at all. 2 days later, after securing reluctant permission from Melissa through a generous donation to her Atlantic City fund, Maxwell took Ethan to the architecture exhibition. Watching the boy's face light up with enthusiasm, Maxwell felt a connection deepening, a bond that transcended the mystery of their resemblance. "This is the best day ever," Ethan declared as they examined a scale model of a revolutionary eco-friendly skyscraper. That night, Maxwell invited Ethan to stay in one of his guest rooms rather than return to an empty apartment. As he helped the boy settle in, Maxwell noticed a small scar at Ethan's hairline, identical to one he'd had since childhood after falling off a swing. The coincidences were becoming too numerous to ignore. Maxwell needed answers. The next morning, while Ethan was still asleep, Maxwell received a call from Richard. "Max, what the hell are you doing?" Richard demanded. "Melissa called me in a panic saying you've practically kidnapped her nephew." "What?" "She gave permission for him to stay with me," Maxwell replied, confused. She's my wife's sister, remember? She claims you manipulated her and she wants Ethan back immediately. Maxwell felt a cold dread. Richard, there's something not right about Ethan's situation. Melissa neglects him. She leaves him alone for days. That's not for you to judge, Richard interrupted. What's going on with you? Melissa mentioned you think Ethan looks like you. She thinks you've lost your mind, and frankly, I'm concerned too. After hanging up, Maxwell found Ethan in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. Is everything okay? The boy asked, sensing Maxwell's distress. Maxwell forced a smile. Everything's fine. But your aunt wants you to come home today. Ethan's face fell. Did I do something wrong? Absolutely not, Maxwell assured him. But I need to ask you something important. Would you be willing to take a simple test? Just a swab inside your cheek. It might help explain why we look so much alike. Ethan considered this. You think we might really be related somehow? I think it's possible, Maxwell said carefully. Ethan agreed, and Maxwell arranged for a discreet testing service to collect samples that afternoon. After Ethan reluctantly returned to Melissa's apartment, Maxwell threw himself into investigating Catherine Collins with renewed determination. His breakthrough came 3 days later. Catherine had briefly worked as a research consultant for a biotech startup that Pierce Technologies had acquired 6 years ago. During the same period, Maxwell had participated in a sperm donation program as part of a company-wide initiative to support fertility research. The pieces were falling into place, but Maxwell needed confirmation. When the paternity test results arrived by secure email, his hands trembled as he opened the file. The clinical language swam before his eyes until he focused on the conclusion. 99.9998% probability of paternity. Ethan was his biological son. Maxwell sat in stunned silence, emotions washing over him in waves: shock, joy, anger, confusion. Catherine had used his donated sample without his knowledge. She had raised his son without ever telling him of Ethan's existence. Yet he couldn't feel anger toward her. She had clearly been a loving mother who had nurtured Ethan's talents and intelligence. His phone rang. It was Ethan. Mr. Pierce? I don't know what to do. The boy's voice shook with fear. Aunt Melissa is really mad. She says I can't see you again, and she's talking about sending me to some boarding school upstate. I don't want to go. Ethan, listen to me, Maxwell said firmly. I won't let that happen. There's something important I need to tell you. Before Maxwell could continue, he heard a commotion on Ethan's end of the line. Give me that phone. Melissa's voice shrieked. Who are you talking to? The line went dead. Maxwell was in his car within minutes, speeding toward Brooklyn. When no one answered at Melissa's apartment, a neighbor informed him that Melissa had left with a suitcase and a boy about 20 minutes earlier. Racing back to his office, Maxwell had his security team track Melissa's cell phone while he called his lawyer. I need emergency custody papers drawn up immediately, Maxwell instructed. I have DNA proof that Ethan Collins is my biological son, and I have reason to believe he's in danger. 3 hours later, Maxwell, his lawyer, and 2 police officers arrived at a modest motel near the interstate. Melissa answered the door, her face contorting with rage when she saw Maxwell. You have no right to follow us, she spat. Actually, Mr. Pierce has every right, his lawyer interjected, presenting the emergency custody order and paternity test results. Melissa's face paled as she scanned the documents. This is impossible. Catherine always said the father was anonymous. Where is Ethan? Maxwell demanded. The boy appeared behind his aunt, his eyes red from crying but lighting up at the sight of Maxwell. Ethan, Maxwell said gently, I found out why we look so alike. I'm your father. Ethan's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. My father? But how? It's complicated, Maxwell said. But it's true. And if you want, you can come live with me instead of going to boarding school. Ethan looked between Maxwell and his aunt, who was now arguing heatedly with the lawyer about financial arrangements. You really want me? Ethan asked, his voice small. Maxwell knelt to meet his son's eyes. More than anything in the world. That night, Ethan slept in what would become his permanent room in Maxwell's penthouse. As Maxwell watched his son sleeping peacefully, he marveled at how his life had transformed in just a week. The emptiness he had carried for years was gone, replaced by something he had never expected to experience: the profound love of a father for his child. The next morning, over breakfast, Maxwell and Ethan began planning their future together. Schools to consider, rooms to redecorate, a summer trip to visit Maxwell's parents, who were overjoyed at the news of their grandson. I still can't believe you found me, Ethan said, his eyes bright with happiness. It's like Mom always said about connections we haven't figured out yet. Maxwell smiled, thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. Against all medical odds, against all probability, he had found his son, the child he never thought he could have, the family he had stopped hoping for. Sometimes, Maxwell replied, the impossible turns out to be possible after all. If you're enjoying this video and want more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out on any of the amazing stories we have coming up. Your support really helps the channel grow and keeps us bringing you more of what you love. Thank you. 6 months passed, bringing remarkable changes to both Maxwell and Ethan's lives. The penthouse that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sounds of life, Ethan's laughter, his endless questions, his enthusiastic explanations of new architectural designs he was creating. Maxwell had transformed an unused room into a studio for his son, equipping it with drafting tables, art supplies, and advanced modeling software that Ethan was mastering with astonishing speed. The day Maxwell surprised Ethan with the completed studio remained one of his favorite memories. He had worked late for weeks, coordinating with designers while keeping the project secret from his son. When he finally led Ethan into the room, blindfolded, the boy's gasp of astonishment followed by tears of joy made every late night worth it. "This is really all for me?" Ethan had whispered, running his fingers reverently over the professional-grade equipment. "All for you," Maxwell confirmed. "I thought every great architect needs a proper workspace to create." Ethan had thrown his arms around Maxwell's waist, holding on tight. Thank you," he repeated before pulling away with embarrassment at his emotional display. Maxwell knelt to meet his eyes. "Never apologize for showing how you feel, Ethan. Not with me." Those words became something of a mantra between them as they navigated their new relationship, an encouragement to honesty that helped them forge a bond stronger than either had thought possible. The adjustment hadn't been without challenges. Ethan still woke from nightmares sometimes, calling out for his mother. Maxwell would sit with him, sharing stories about Catherine that he had gathered from her former colleagues, helping to keep her memory alive while they built their own relationship. There were behavioral issues too. Years of neglect under Melissa's care had left Ethan with insecurities that manifested in occasional testing of boundaries, fears of abandonment, and difficulty trusting that his new life was permanent. Maxwell had reduced his working hours, delegating more responsibilities at Pierce Technologies to focus on being a present father. Richard, initially skeptical about the sudden custody battle, had become one of their biggest supporters after seeing the positive change in his friend and the undeniable bond between father and son. "You know, I barely recognize you anymore," Richard commented one evening as they watched Ethan playing with Richard's children in the backyard of the Coleman's suburban home. "In a good way, I mean." Maxwell nodded, his eyes never leaving his son. "I barely recognize myself. I keep thinking about how close I came to missing this, to never knowing he existed." "Do you ever regret the way you found out?" Richard asked. "About Catherine using your donation without your knowledge?" Maxwell considered the question. "I wish I'd known sooner, had more time with him. But Catherine gave him a good life, loved him well. How can I be angry about that?" He paused. "The only regret I have is that Ethan lost her so young." On a crisp autumn day, Maxwell sat in the headmaster's office at Westridge Academy, one of New York's most prestigious private schools. Ethan's test scores had been exceptional, and the school was eager to enroll him, but Maxwell had concerns. "I appreciate the academic rigor your institution offers," Maxwell said, "but what about emotional support? My son lost his mother last year and has been through significant changes. He needs more than just academic excellence." The headmaster, Dr. Harmon, studied Maxwell with newfound respect. "Mr. Pierce, our counseling program is one of the best in the country. We understand that exceptional children often face exceptional challenges. I assure you we'll support Ethan in every way possible." Satisfied, Maxwell signed the enrollment papers. Later that afternoon, he took Ethan to visit Catherine's grave for the first time since the boy had come to live with him. They stood together in the peaceful cemetery, placing fresh flowers beside the simple headstone. "Do you think she knew?" Ethan asked quietly. "That you were my father?" Maxwell put his arm around his son's shoulders. "I think she must have. I've been piecing together the timeline. She took the consulting job at my subsidiary company right after learning she was pregnant with you. I think she might have been trying to learn more about me, to see what kind of man your father was." Ethan smiled sadly. "She would have liked you. She always said that kindness was more important than success. She sounds very wise," Maxwell replied. I wish I could have thanked her for giving me you. On the drive home, Maxwell received an unexpected call from Dr. Reynolds. Mr. Pierce, I've been reviewing your case as part of our long-term study, and I've come across something unusual in your original test results. Maxwell put the call on speaker as Ethan was absorbed in a book beside him. What kind of unusual? There was an anomaly in one of your chromosome markers, something we would typically flag for additional testing. Somehow this was overlooked in your original diagnosis. I'd like you to come in for a follow-up if you're willing. 2 weeks later, Maxwell sat in Dr. Reynolds' office, processing the revised diagnosis. So you're saying I'm not actually infertile? That the original assessment was an error? Dr. Reynolds looked apologetic. Not entirely an error, but certainly incomplete. Your condition does significantly reduce fertility, but not to the extent we initially believed. With the right partner and circumstances, natural conception would be difficult but within the realm of possibility. Your case is actually quite rare and fascinating from a medical perspective. Maxwell thought of Claire, the years of believing he could never have children, the engagement that had ended because of this belief. Then he looked at the photo of Ethan on his phone's lock screen and felt a wave of acceptance wash over him. Life had taken him exactly where he needed to be, even if the path had been winding and painful. That evening, Maxwell received another surprise, a letter from Catherine's attorney, sent as part of the execution of a trust that had activated on Ethan's 11th birthday. It contained a handwritten note from Catherine, dated shortly before her death. My dearest Ethan. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you and you've reached your 11th birthday. There's something important you should know. Your father wasn't just an anonymous donor, as I've allowed you to believe. His name is Maxwell Pierce, and I chose him specifically after learning about his work in sustainable energy, work that aligned with my own values and dreams for the future. I made the choice not to tell him about you, which may have been wrong. At the time, I wanted to raise you on my own terms without complications. But you deserve to know your father, and he deserves to know the amazing boy you've become. Enclosed is all the information you'll need to find him, should you choose to. This decision is yours to make when you're ready. Know that whatever you decide, I will always love you beyond measure. All my love, Mom. Maxwell read the letter with tears streaming down his face, then showed it to Ethan, who had been watching him anxiously. She wanted us to find each other, Ethan whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. She made sure we would. Maxwell nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, he said, Your mother gave me the greatest gift possible twice over. First by bringing you into the world and then by making sure we'd find each other when you needed me most. As fall turned to winter, Maxwell took Ethan to Connecticut to spend Christmas with his parents and extended family. Elizabeth Pierce had transformed her home into a winter wonderland for her grandson's first Christmas with them, and Maxwell's father had built an elaborate model train set that circled the entire living room. You should have seen your father with trains when he was your age, Thomas Pierce told Ethan as they adjusted the miniature landscape together. He was always redesigning the track layouts, building tiny buildings for the towns. We should have known he'd end up constructing real buildings someday. Maxwell watched his father and son bonding, seeing the continuation of a legacy he had once thought impossible. Later, as the family gathered around the piano for carols, Maxwell slipped away to the study to make a phone call he'd been contemplating for weeks. Claire answered on the third ring. Max? This is unexpected. Merry Christmas, Claire, he said warmly. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all. John's just putting the baby down for a nap. She paused. I heard about your son. It's all over the society pages. Bachelor billionaire discovers secret heir. I'm happy for you, Max, truly. Thank you, Maxwell replied. That's actually why I'm calling. I wanted to tell you that you were right to leave when you did. We both deserved the families we wanted, and now we both have them. There was a smile in Claire's voice as she answered, That's a remarkably healthy perspective. Fatherhood agrees with you. It's changed everything, Maxwell admitted. I just wanted to clear the air, make sure there were no lingering hard feelings. Life takes unexpected turns, but I think we both ended up exactly where we needed to be. After hanging up, Maxwell rejoined his family, taking a seat beside Ethan on the piano bench as his mother played Silent Night. Ethan leaned against him, and Maxwell felt the deepest contentment he had ever known. On New Year's Day, Maxwell and Ethan stood on the observation deck of Pierce Tower, watching the first sunrise of the year paint the city skyline in gold. The past year had been transformative for them both. Maxwell had learned to prioritize what truly mattered, while Ethan had blossomed with security and love he'd been missing. The week before, they had visited Melissa one last time to collect the remainder of Ethan's belongings. The woman had been cold but resigned, having accepted a generous settlement in exchange for relinquishing all claims to guardianship. As they were leaving, she had stopped Ethan briefly. "You look happy," she said, something like regret flickering across her face. "I am," Ethan had replied simply, with a confidence he hadn't possessed 6 months earlier. Now, as dawn broke over the city they both loved, Maxwell reached into his coat. "I have something for you," Maxwell said, handing Ethan a large leather portfolio. "It's a bit early for your birthday, but I couldn't wait." Ethan opened it to find architectural plans, detailed blueprints for a new building project. "The Catherine Collins Foundation for Young Scientists," Ethan read from the title page, his voice filled with wonder. "What is this?" "It's our next project," Maxwell explained. "A center to support kids who love science and innovation with scholarships, labs and mentorship programs. I thought we could design it together, my engineering knowledge and your architectural vision. A way to honor your mother and help other kids like you." Ethan's face lit up with excitement, then softened with emotion. She would have loved this. "There's more," Maxwell said, turning to the last page where a legal document was attached. "The adoption papers are ready. If you still want to make it official, we can file them this week." Ethan looked up at him with those mirror-image blue eyes, now brimming with tears. "You've already been my father in all the ways that matter," he said. "But yes, I want to make it official." Maxwell pulled his son into a tight embrace, marveling at how this child he never expected to have had transformed his understanding of success, fulfillment, and purpose. The empire of glass and steel he had built paled in comparison to the relationship they were building together, a connection that would outlast any skyscraper. As they stood together watching the city awaken, Maxwell reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had spent years believing that his legacy would be limited to the buildings he created and the company he built. Now he understood that true legacy wasn't about leaving your name on structures or stock certificates. It was about the love you shared, the lives you touched, and the values you passed on to the next generation. 3 weeks earlier, Maxwell had made another significant change to his life. After meeting with his executive team, he had announced a new company-wide policy providing substantial parental leave for all employees, regardless of how they formed their families, through birth, adoption, fostering, or other circumstances. He had also established an on-site childcare center at Pierce Technologies headquarters and created a family-friendly work environment that had quickly become the talk of the industry. "The greatest innovation we can create isn't a product," he had told his surprised board members. "It's a culture that values what truly matters, the connections that give our work meaning." Some had grumbled about costs, but Richard had backed him completely. "Trust me," his friend had said to the skeptics. "A CEO who understands what matters produces better results than one who's only focused on the bottom line." The changes had already begun improving employee morale and attracting top talent who valued work-life balance. Maxwell knew it was just the beginning of how he wanted to transform his company, and society, to better support families of all kinds. The greatest achievement of his life wasn't Pierce Technologies or his billion-dollar fortune. It was standing beside him, sketching building designs in a notebook, eyes bright with dreams for the future. Maxwell had once believed himself incapable of creating life, only to discover that life had other plans. Plans that included giving him the son he never thought he could have and the family he had stopped hoping for. Sometimes the things we believe are impossible turn out to be our destiny. Sometimes the children we think we'll never have are waiting to find us. And sometimes, when we least expect it, we discover that the face we've been looking at in the mirror all our lives was preparing us for the moment we'd recognize it in someone else. The moment we'd find our true purpose, our greatest joy, and our most meaningful legacy. As Ethan looked up at him with a smile that reflected his own, Maxwell knew with absolute certainty that no fortune he had amassed could compare to the treasure he had found in this remarkable boy who carried his face, his blood, and now his name. Together they would build something far more enduring than towers of steel and glass. They would build a future shaped by the love of a father and son who found each other against all odds, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that seem impossible until they happen. 1 year later, Maxwell and Ethan stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Catherine Collins Foundation building. The architectural marvel combined Ethan's visionary designs with Maxwell's engineering expertise, a gleaming structure of glass and sustainable materials that seemed to reach toward the future while honoring the past. As photographers captured the moment of father and son turning the first shovelful of earth together, Maxwell felt a sense of completeness he had never imagined possible. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter in Central Park had transformed not just their lives, but would soon change the lives of countless young scientists who would find their potential nurtured within these walls. "Mom would be so proud," Ethan whispered, looking up at the rendering of the building displayed behind them. "Of you," Maxwell replied, squeezing his son's shoulder. "Every day of you." And in that perfect moment, as reporters called questions and cameras flashed around them, Maxwell knew with absolute certainty that some destinies find us even when we believe they're impossible. Sometimes our greatest limitations become the doorways to our most profound blessings. And sometimes, against all odds and medical predictions, the family we never thought we could have is waiting to complete us in ways we never dreamed possible. Thank you so much for watching our story today. If you enjoyed this emotional journey of Maxwell and Ethan, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our new uploads. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Did it touch your heart? What was your favorite moment? And if you know someone who would enjoy this video, please share it with them. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and reminds us all that miracles happen every day, often in the most unexpected ways. Until next time.